Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to folks on the West Coast. My name is Nzingha Hooker. I'm a staff attorney at the National Employment Law Project, where my work focuses on social insurance programs, and I will be moderating this exciting conversation on work sharing today. We will be hearing from about 4 amazing advocates who will talk about work sharing, its benefits, implementation, bargaining strategies, and ongoing work sharing campaigns. Like Bukola said, you can use the Q&A for questions that you have throughout. At the end, we're going to have a Q&A section. And I'll also say, if you could drop in the chat function, if you could drop your name, your location, maybe your pronouns, and if you're affiliated with a particular organization or union or worker center, if you would add that as well. One other thing I do want to note is that throughout the webinar, the panelists will be sharing information on policies and legal information as well. And I just want to make sure that I note that that should not be taken as legal advice. So with that being said, I'll advance to the next slide. And we'll start with an introduction. We'll move on to the work sharing overview, which George Wentworth will give. And then we'll move to 2 different perspectives. We'll talk about the union perspective, and we'll also talk about the worker center perspective. And at that point, we'll have about a 15-minute Q&A section. So just to give some context to what we'll be talking about today in terms of work sharing, in this unprecedented health crisis and economic and unemployment crisis, almost every sector of the economy, including public sector and nonprofits, had to contemplate layoffs for their employees as a cost-cutting strategy. Work sharing programs have been available in half the states, and it enables employers who are facing a temporary economic downturn to avert layoffs by reducing their employees' hours and providing this unemployment insurance benefit, this work sharing benefit. During this particular pandemic, when so many workers have already been laid off, work sharing has also been used as a rehiring tool for businesses that want to restart gradually and bring employees back on reduced hours. Work sharing also holds, and we like to note this, that work sharing also holds the benefit to advance racial equity in the labor market. Black workers are more likely to be the first fired during economic downturns as a consequence of systemic racist hiring and firing practices, and programs that promote workforce retention, especially during an economic downturn during the recession, has the potential to benefit workers of color. So we just wanted to make sure that as we're talking about work sharing and we're doing advocacy for this program, that we are framing it in that way, that work sharing could be a benefit to Black workers, to other workers of color. So with all that in mind, I'll advance us forward to the next section, which is an overview of work sharing. And George is going to talk about that, how that program operates, recent developments since the CARES Act, and other mechanisms of the work sharing program. And before I turn it over to you, George, I'm just going to give a brief read off a little bit of your bio. So George Wentworth is of counsel with the National Employment Law Project, where he has worked since 2009. He provides legal research, policy analysis, and legislative advocacy in the areas of unemployment insurance. George has worked extensively with state organizations advocating for strong UI programs and has testified before numerous state legislatures. He was a part of NELP's effort to ensure a strong federal response to record high unemployment during and immediately after the Great Recession. Before joining NELP, George worked at the Connecticut Department of Labor for 35 years, where he spent 20 years as the agency's chief legal counsel and 15 years managing unemployment insurance and employment and training programs. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to you, George.
Thank you. Please advance past this slide. So we're going to talk about work sharing today. I think we've got varying levels of understanding and experience with it. So I'm going to try and make sure we reach everybody. First of all, work sharing is a form of unemployment insurance. It is, as Z outlined, an alternative to layoffs when a business is facing some sort of temporary financial slide or economic decline. And the alternative basically means instead of laying off workers, that the employer reduces hours for a larger number of workers and pays, and unemployment insurance benefits known as work sharing benefits are paid out on a pro rata basis for the days of unemployment that are being experienced as a result of the program. And again, this is something that, if an employer normally puts workers on a 4-day week, partial unemployment insurance is not going to work under normal state benefits. In no state can you be unemployed for 1 day and qualify for a partial unemployment benefit, but under work sharing plans you can. Next slide. So I'm just this is an example we're laying out here. ABC Corporation has a temporary downturn. They would normally need to lay off 10 employees, but under a work sharing plan, they go to the state and say, instead of laying off 2, what we would like to do is reduce the hours of all 10 of our employees by 20%, thereby putting them on a 4-day week. In this example, we assume a 40-hour week normally earns an employee $800. Under the work sharing plan, their work schedules are reduced by 20%. And so what we're going to see is they're going to receive 20% of their unemployment benefit. If they're normally earning $800 a week, let's say their unemployment benefit is half of that, $400, then the worker is going to receive 20% of $400 or $80 in unemployment insurance. Couple that with the $640 that they would earn for 4 days of work, and they end up with $720 as their total compensation, combining the work sharing with their actual wages. Next slide. So why do this? For employees, there's a lot of benefits. First of all, in that example I just gave you, everybody keeps their job. So employers that are doing this are typically looking to retain all of their workforce or most of their workforce. So for employees, there's retaining your job, the economic security that comes with continuing your health insurance and retirement benefits, because under every work sharing plan, employers are required to do that. The idea of staying employer attached is really important. As we know, as we're seeing in this recession and in the last one, the longer you're unemployed, the harder it is to find a new job. And there is the financial hardship that comes with that, with basically having to start all over again with a new employer. So this is really all about keeping the workers and the employer connected as they go through the economic downturn and hopefully come out on the other side. With that also is a whole range of positive social consequences, not the least of which is, on the psychology and emotions of the workers who aren't being laid off, who are basically staying on the job. Next slide. This is work sharing. It's important to remember that to do this, it's the employer who needs to submit a plan to the state. So why is an employer doing it? As I said, the number one reason is to retain experienced and qualified workers. You'll see that in a lot of work sharing plans, especially in the manufacturing industry, where there may be union contracts, seniority is going to be the principle in terms of, for last hired, first fired. And for an employer that wants to keep recently hired workers who may have a lot of, more up-to-date skills. This is an opportunity to basically keep the entire workforce together. It has the additional advantages of sort of allowing the employer to maintain continuity while they're managing their business through the downturn, not having to lose employees that might be key to whatever work the employer is still doing. The employer is able to stay in a ready mode, and when things pick up again, not have to go through the process of hiring, retraining employees who you lost because you had to lay them off. A lot of studies have shown tremendous increase in morale for the workforce, which is in fact a benefit to the employer. Sort of this idea of one for all and all for one, that employees are generally much happier with employers who are thinking about keeping their whole workforce together. There's a lot of misinformation out there about this program being expensive, but basically the UI tax costs are the same if you are laying off 2 workers or if you are putting 10 workers on reduced hours. Basically, the unemployment insurance charges are going to be pretty much the same. And finally, there's something we'll talk about a little bit more is in this year, as part of the CARES Act, employers who use work sharing are getting a full 100% federal reimbursement for all work sharing benefits that they're paying out in calendar year 2020. Next slide. So Z alluded to this, and we've seen a lot more usage of the program. Again, the traditional usage is we're entering an economic downturn. I'm faced with having to lay off workers, and instead of that, I'm going to spread the pain and reduce the hours to a larger number of workers. In this recession, what's so uniquely different about it is that pretty much overnight, everybody in the world got laid off. So we've seen, tens of millions in March and April, and the narrative in many states over the last several months has been as economic restrictions are lifted, employers are reopening, but they're not able to reopen at 100% capacity. They've got a lot of factors, including the safety of their workers, to consider, and also reduced demand as consumers are naturally wary about going into the marketplace during the pandemic. So as businesses adapt to these restrictions, work sharing is a program that can be used as employers sort of gradually ramp up from a place where first the employer might have been fully closed to being, let's say, 50% reopened. Next slide. This slide kind of lays out what that might look like. So let's say we have an employer who in March or April had to lay off all 20 of their employees. And now it's a couple months later, the business is reopening, but there's only enough work for 10 employees. So under normal conditions, an employer would rehire 10 workers and leave 10 on layoff. I'm sorry. Normally they would rehire 10 and leave 10 on layoff. Under work sharing, what we'd recommend would be that the employer hire back all 20 employees to work half-time and then have them all receive a work sharing benefit that's equal to 50% of their unemployment insurance. And then, of course, as conditions become safer, business improve, work hours and wages can increase while the work sharing benefit is phased out. This is largely an equitable approach that keeps all the workers attached. And as you've been part of these of the drama around reopening in many of the states, there's a lot of tension between around workers concerned about their safety, but also workers, employers not wanting to leave workers entirely on unemployment insurance. So this is kind of a middle ground. Next slide. So just a quick history. I mean, work sharing, known formally as short time compensation in federal law, began in the 80s. It's kind of an experiment. Only about a third of all states used the program. It didn't get much usage in the 90s when the economy was really good. But when the Great Recession hit in 2007, those 17 states that had programs suddenly saw a huge spike in activity. And it was because we had so many employers who maybe had never had to lay people off before, who were looking for some kind of alternative. And work sharing is pretty much the only game in town. There have been studies that have shown during the period from 2008 to 2013, almost more than 500,000 jobs were saved through work sharing. In 2012, Congress finally put the program permanently into federal law under the Layoff Prevention Act, which provided temporary federal funding that lasted. Benefits were totally federally paid for 2.5 years, and it put in incentives to encourage other states to enact work sharing laws, and 11 states and DC enacted work sharing laws during that period. Next slide. So here are the states that have work sharing programs. There are 25 that are really active, 2 that are of more recent vintage and are just getting off the ground, Virginia being one of those. And then you can see here the states in gray are the ones that do not have active work sharing programs. Next slide. So I'm going to go through these very quickly. The federal law basically says there's 9 things that the states have to have in their law if they're going to enact a work sharing statute. One is the employer's participation has to be voluntary. And this is a big point, especially if you're looking at business resistance to enacting a law. It's voluntary. It's nothing that any employer is ever required to do. It's just one more tool in their toolbox, to use the vernacular, in dealing with an economic downturn. The law has to say that employers will reduce hours in lieu of layoffs. So there's always a statement that I'm going to have reduced the hours of X number of employees during this the life of this plan. And if I didn't do that, I would have laid off X employees. So that employers should only be doing this if they can attest to the fact that they would have been laying workers off instead. The range of hours reductions can be anywhere from 10% up to 60%. States vary on that a little bit. Some have a shorter range, but that you can have reduced hours by up to 3 days of unemployment. Next slide. Again, this idea that the benefit is a prorated share of the unemployment benefits worker would normally have gotten. Employees who are on work sharing, they don't have to go out and look for work. They meet the able and available requirements of the law as long as they are available for work with their employer that's in the work sharing plan. There's an option for work sharing employers to do classroom training if they want to. Next slide. Employers have to continue whatever benefits were in place before the plan began, and that includes health and retirement benefits, and no reductions in those because you're in work sharing. Employers have to submit a written plan to the state exactly how they're going to implement the program, and they basically have to agree to not violate any other state or federal laws. Next slide. So under the CARES Act, as I think you're all aware of, the federal PUC program, which provided an additional $600 to every form of unemployment benefit. That ended July 25th, but it was applicable to the work sharing program. So even somebody who only had a day of unemployment under work sharing was seeing a $600 supplement under the PUC program. That has expired. It's still the subject of negotiations. Presumably a reauthorization of the PUC program would mean it would attach again to work sharing payments. Next slide. So the CARES Act basically did an important thing by saying any work sharing benefits paid out in calendar year 2020 would be federally funded. That was a huge incentive, gave employers a huge incentive to use the program. It also did something that it had done previously with the 2012 law, which is to give incentives to states to enact work sharing. There's $100 million in administrative and federal grants. A third of those dollars are basically to help the states implement or improve their programs if they already have them. And 2/3 was basically for grants to market the program, promote enrollment. This is basically in response to the concern that very few employers, even in the states that have the programs, know about it. Next slide. So one of the things that's good about this federal reimbursement is that it makes this program more attractive to governmental and nonprofit employers. Government and nonprofit don't typically have much interest in work sharing because they, rather than getting charges on their taxes that are kind of absorbed over a 3-year period, reimbursing employers pay dollar for dollar. So if workers get $1,000 in the month of October, at the end of the month, the public sector and nonprofit employer is going to get a bill for $1,000. So work sharing isn't all that attractive normally, but with the full federal reimbursement, it completely it spiked interest, and we've seen examples like the state of Michigan put something like 30,000 employees on furlough, 2 furlough days every pay period, and paid work sharing during that time. The city of Rochester, a county in Pennsylvania, put probation and domestic relations officers on the plan. So a lot more interest in the public and nonprofit sector. Next slide. So this is my last slide, just basically saying work sharing activity is exploding in a lot of states. While this is a program that's typically been heavy manufacturing, you're seeing a lot more types of employers getting interested. I just looked at one state's activity and saw, a lot of manufacturing, aerospace industry, for example, but I saw transportation, school bus companies, a lot of consultants, restaurants, bakeries, medical and surgical offices. As you recall, a lot of slowdown in that during the pandemic, caterers, a lot of professional consulting businesses. So much more widespread usage. States with active programs, Washington is probably one of the leading programs in the state, Rhode Island another. It's representing, up between 10 and 20% of all continued claims in those states. Typically elsewhere, it's more like 3 to 4%. There is currently legislation sponsored by Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, who was sort of the godfather of work sharing, that would called the Workforce Retention Act. It would require all states to have work sharing programs, which they're not currently mandated to. It would make the federal reimbursement permanent. It would eliminate some of the eligibility restrictions that some states have imposed that have made it trickier for some state employers to participate. Would increase the permissible hours reduction up to 80% and make the program easier for employers to use, primarily through better automation, and expand employer outreach and education. Thank you. I'll hand it back to Z.
Thank you, George. And before we move to the next panelist, just want to say that people continue to put your questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom feature. And also, if you haven't already, make sure you drop your name, your pronoun, your location, and organization affiliation in the chat. And just another note, we'll be responding to all the questions in the Q&A feature at the end of the webinar. So the next panelist is Jokebed Jojo Morinvil, and Jojo will speak about One DC's ongoing work sharing campaign, the goals of the campaign, and why she thinks Black Worker Center members may benefit from work sharing. And before I turn over to you, Jojo, I just want to read a part of your bio. Jojo graduated from Rutgers University in 2018, where she was a student organizer and organized the Fight for 15 campaign on campus. In the same year, she moved to DC, where she interned at Jobs with Justice through the Will Empower Apprenticeship Program. She has worked with unions, grassroots organizations, students, and workers on local, national, and international worker rights campaigns. She is now the Black Workers and Wellness Center organizer for One DC, where she organizes with Black community members on racial and economic equity. And I'll turn it over to you, Jojo.
Thank you, Nzingha, and thank you, George, for that overview. So I started with One DC back in June, and that was well into the whole COVID pandemic. And one of the first things I started working on was actually the shared work program, work sharing, or short time compensation, whatever term you want to use. And the first thing we did was research on it. So as you can see, this chart here marks July 2019, which was pre-COVID times. And as like my job is focused on Black workers, Black residents in DC, and we found this graph, this chart, and it breaks down unemployment and employment by ward. So our focus was wards 7 and 8, which are predominantly Black wards. And as you can see all the way to the right, the unemployment rate is the highest in those two wards. They are 9.8 and 12.8. And if you want to go to the next slide. So fast forward to a year later, those margin points moved about 5 to 6%, which follows the national trend. At the time, nationally, the unemployment rate for Black workers in the US was about 4.6%. So even in Ward 8, it's higher than a national percentage point. So we, when I started, I was working with Nzingha, who's part of our Right to Income community, two of my coworkers, and Kitty Richards, who gave me a debrief on this program, and we got to work on that. So what we did was we sent out a survey to our membership to figure out which industries they were located in, how they were impacted by COVID. And we got a couple people to respond, and we got some numbers out of it. So 75% of the respondents were laid off, lost hours, or furloughed. 69.4% were the sole earners in their household. 49.2% had dependents. 73% did not receive financial support outside of their primary job, and 68.3% were interested in learning more about the shared work program. So since then, we've been sharing this information to our membership and attempting to work with other labor organizations and unions to spread the word about this. We've also been part of different budget hearings here in DC. I've spoken to Councilmember Silverman, Margaret O'Hara about the program, but it's been super hard, and I'm sure anyone in DC can attest to this, to get through to DOES. You can go on to the next slide. So a few of the things that we learned about the program, as George mentioned, so some of the hardest hit industries have been restaurant, hospitality workers, and childcare providers. But this program, as George mentioned, has been expanding, and we've been seeing a lot of folks from different industries using this program and taking advantage of it. Through a budget hearing, we learned that workers, there's a government grant, and workers hired on that grant have been hired to work on that grant and process and approve claims. We also learned that 77 employers have applied, 52 of those plans have been approved, and 32 of those plans have been executed. But it hasn't been all neat and nice. Folks who were able to get their plan approved have had some issues with that. So some of the next steps that we're looking to do is work with unions and different labor groups, particularly ROC, AFSCME, DCJ, to do shared work trainings so that we can encourage employers to apply and have employees talk to their employers about applying to the program. We are also looking to have members testify at the Workforce Committee Roundtable this upcoming Monday. And a couple things we want to know is who is the shared work coordinator, how many people are working on their shared work claims, which industries were approved and denied and why, and how we can help publicize the program. As I mentioned, some of the roadblocks we've come across is that people are applying for the program and then getting denied based off information they were given by DOES. So we're looking to work with the council to see if we can put the information out, they get people the right information so that they can apply, and increases their chances of being approved for the program. Next slide. And some of the benefits, as George mentioned as well, workers get to keep their job. They get to work in an environment they are familiar with, so there's no new trainings they have to do. They don't have to learn anything new. Workers are still able to receive benefits, so their healthcare can't be, affected, and they're also allowed to receive UI benefits as well. As Georgia mentioned as well, they don't have to do a job search because they already have a job there, and employers do not have to hire or train new staff. And a few of the challenges is that there has been an influx of applications, obviously because of COVID, which is slowing down the process and making the process a little bit more difficult. And DUS, to be honest, has been inefficient in processing claims. It seems that the only way to really get their attention is through pressure, like legally or having a union, which is something that we're trying to work through, and why we're trying to expand our partnership with unions and with different labor orgs so we can kind of diversify resources, but also apply pressure to the council so that we can get more resources for the program. Only the government employees who are hired on this grant are allowed to approve claims. Director Hughes, who heads the Department of Employment Services here in DC, claims that she is looking for more flexibility on that so that folks outside of the grant can approve claims so that the process can be faster. And then some employers have been given the wrong information, as I mentioned before, resulting in denied claim, and they have to wait 30 days before reapplying to the program. So that's one of the things we're trying to prevent, because people need a job, and that's what we're trying to do and push.
Thank you, Jojo. And with that, I'll turn it over to the union perspective and introduce our first panelist. So we'll have two panelists for this particular part of the webinar. Our first panelist is Matt Pearce, who will speak about successful bargaining for work sharing in lieu of layoffs at the LA Times. And Matt has been a reporter for the Los Angeles Times since 2012 and was a founding member of his newsroom union in 2018. This year, Matt was elected president of the Media Guild of the West, which represents journalists at the Los Angeles Times, the Arizona Republic, and Pop-Up Magazine. He attended the University of Missouri and hails from the greater Kansas City, Missouri area. With that said, I'll turn over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Nzingha. Nice to see everyone here and see everyone interested in the work sharing program. This was a big journey for us over the summer that I'll tell you about. I also want to say up front, so in my day job, I'm a reporter at the LA Times. So I'm appearing here in my union capacity, and if I express any personal opinions, they're not the opinions of the LA Times. They're in my role as the union president. So if we can go to the next slide. So we unionized in 2018. Collective bargaining is a very new thing for us. LA Times has been around since 1881. Obviously, we're part of a media industry that has been extremely unstable over the last couple of decades, just constantly hit with layoffs. And in spring 2020, we faced probably one of our biggest threats ever. So as you all know, there's a lot of news this year that journalists have been covering all over the place between the George Floyd protests, the pandemic, the presidential election. And in the middle of this, the pandemic happens, and the shutdowns to the early shutdowns to implement social distancing ended up destroying a lot of advertising revenue for the LA Times and pretty much everybody in the media industry and newspapers. So advertising is still a really, really, really big source of revenue for news organizations like ours. We get a little bit from, not a little bit, but we get quite a bit from subscribers. But we basically faced this situation where we had journalists who had a ton of work to do and a lot of news to cover, and we were essentially losing our ability to fund it. And so newsroom management came to us in the spring and said there was a $2 million hole in the budget and they have to figure out how to close it or they're gonna have to do layoffs. So we're under contract. The contract doesn't give management any ability to unilaterally implement furloughs or pay cuts or to take away our 401k benefits or anything like that. Their only unilateral option is to implement layoffs, which they told us, to their credit, that they didn't want to do. They, you know, at the beginning of this, we were all hoping that the pandemic was going to be a temporary condition. And so we were planning to find a way to try to hibernate or cut our way through this temporary shutdown. And so in the middle of all this, as this is happening, in my job as a reporter, I had actually started looking at the CARES Act and discovered something really interesting about the CARES Act, which is this work sharing program, which I had never heard of before. I had never had any personal experience with. No one in our newsroom had had any experience with it. I even talked to some of our colleagues in the California Labor Federation, and I was trying to find other unions that had experience with it, and was running out of luck. But I discovered this really kind of amazing thing about the CARES Act, which is that work sharing claims, where you might have as little as a 10% hours and pay reduction, would make you eligible for the $600 a week FPUC benefit under the CARES Act over the summer. So if you go to the next slide, I think, I will show you the magic chart that kind of persuaded me to pursue this in a second. So we decided that work sharing was going to be the best path forward for us. The problem is we didn't really know anything about it, so we immediately launched into researching the program, how it worked, how do you apply for it, what's the eligibility, and the plan that we came up with is that we were going to have a 20% reduction for all of our members in California and Washington, D.C. For 12 weeks, and in exchange for a no layoff agreement from management. And we helped management apply for the work sharing programs in California and Washington, D.C. So that would make everybody eligible for the prorated state unemployment benefits. So for most of our members in California, which is where the bulk of us are, that was going to be about $90 a week. That would be the equivalent of 1 day's worth of unemployment, which would trigger the $600 a week CARES Act stimulus. And so let's go to the next slide here. This is the thing that really knocked our socks off when we looked at it. So then these are rough numbers, and this is a spreadsheet I prepared pretty early on. But this is hours reductions for various levels of pay, and the net gain or loss when you add in the $600 a week CARES Act benefit. And what you see here is that like pretty high earners can take a 20% hours cut and receive the federal stimulus and still come out ahead. So as soon as we saw this, as soon as we figured it out, it was like gravity. It was an irresistible force for us, because one way or another, we knew that we were in trouble. We were not getting sort of targeted assistance from the federal government to keep our journalists on the job. We were really scared of absorbing a pay cut, because that would provide less incentive for the employer to reverse the cuts over time. We really wanted some sort of furlough agreement, and the conditions created by the CARES Act here gave us a way to meet management halfway and say, hey, we found a way in which you can save costs, in which we can also almost totally eliminate the financial burden on our members. And so we presented this to our membership and got overwhelming approval from them to pursue this plan. And so we negotiated this deal with management and executed it. So go to the next slide here. Thank you. So there were a lot of problems, however. So the numbers look really good. The numbers were very attractive to us. We had a lot of members whose partners had been laid off, they're supporting families. And a really big problem that emerged very early was that it was taking forever for us to get approved. First of all, in Washington, D.C., DOES, Jojo talked about, we also had to write a letter to the head of DOES and the DC Council to complain about the fact that it was taking forever to get our application approved. It was extremely difficult to get information out of the agency about how to apply for the program there. Each of these programs are different in each state, so the rules are a little bit different, or the application process is a little bit different. So that was extremely challenging. EDD in California approved our company's application relatively quickly, but the crazy part in California is that all of the process for this was paper-based. All of our members, every pay cycle, had to fill out paper claims from management to mail into EDD through the post in order to have their the claims processed and paid out. And that was absolutely a disaster, first of all, because nobody is centralized at the office. Everybody's working at home because of the pandemic. Second of all, the Postal Service was, as everyone knows, a huge disaster over the summer. So we didn't know whether things were getting lost in the mail, if it was taking a long time for the claims to arrive. And then third of all, there wasn't really a great digital portal to track and deal with the inevitable processing claims that emerged from that. EDD had like some crazy small number, like 2 people or something, answering the phones for this program. So it was extremely difficult for members to call in individually to deal with problems with their claims. And so our members have still only received about half of the payments they're due from reductions that we took from May 10th through August 1st. We had about 20% of our members have to take on debt or other financial assistance while waiting for their benefits to arrive, because as you can remember, everybody's taking a 20% pay cut until that stimulus money arrives. And when the stimulus money arrives, it's been really great. You know, as those payments roll in, it's really helping members fill a lot of gaps. And obviously, like, that's money that's going into the local economy, which is really struggling right now. But this whole process was riddled with problems. And there's a lot of improvements clearly that all these programs can make, because they just were not ready for what happened, despite the really obvious philosophical benefit of this program. So it was a real uneven experience for us. And so I think that's all from me. I don't think there's another slide.
That is. Thank you, Matt. And the next panelist is going to be Bob Estabrook. And before I read Bob's intro, I just want to remind people to continue to put your questions in the Q&A feature of the Zoom, because after Bob, we're going to be moving to the Q&A part of the webinar. So Bob is the Oregon School Employees Association's government relations specialist. His 12 years of experience as a legislative staffer and former employee of Oregon's Bureau of Labor and Industries and Department of Revenue gives him a helpful perspective on all things related to taxes and budgets, but most importantly on how issues impact public employees in Oregon. Since joining OSEA in 2018, Bob has been the union's point person on unemployment insurance for school employees, including the use of work share by Oregon school districts. With that said, I'll turn over to you, Bob. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Z. So I think actually the way that this flows from what Jojo and Matt have been talking about, if you want to go ahead and advance the slide, to our experience in Oregon, is there are a lot of similarities in terms of challenges that we ran into, things that didn't necessarily go the way that we might have wanted, but the underlying principle and the basics of work share are still very favorable. And so what I wanted to highlight really are the lessons learned from our perspective. one thing I'll note at the front end here, the union members that we represent are all school employees, but not teachers. So these are typically hourly employees, a lot of them part-time. And they, even though they are public employees, and there is a certain stereotype that public employees are relatively well paid and relatively insulated from the economy, that's really not true in the case of the folks that I represent. So back in the spring, the writing was on the wall about what was going on with our state budget, where revenue was going. And there was, I think, a fairly clear panic on the part of public entities in Oregon, school districts in particular, about their ability to continue to pay for staff. And so in our case, a lot of the momentum for participating in workshare came from the employer rather than from our members directly. In some cases, we had school districts coming forward with, hey, here's an MOU, we want to do workshare, you need to sign this so we can turn in the application like right now. And obviously on paper, workshare is very favorable, especially with that additional $600 a week benefit on the table. So I think in some cases, we went along with the idea of participating without fully thinking through what that was going to mean or how that was going to work. And Oregon, like a lot of states, had a very, very modest workshare program before the pandemic. It rapidly scaled up and ran into, certainly, it's fair to call them growing pains that we even still to some degree are working through now months later. I think one of the things, as folks have mentioned, about having a process that is paper-based or one that is just not built to the scale of the challenges that employment departments around the country are dealing with right now, it sure would have been nice had we known before that all of these school districts and other employers were going to be submitting paper forms to our state employment department. Those paper forms were going to have to be processed. We're going to have to be hand keyed into their systems when, one, they didn't have the staff to actually do that work, but two, they didn't even have the staff to actually open those forms and get them sorted in the first place. So we really started off at a pretty significant disadvantage, which I think unfortunately was compounded a little bit by a tendency that some of you may be familiar with from government agencies to not be great at communicating to the public about how things are going. One of the special challenges relative to workshare, at least for us, in Oregon's system, the paper was all handled, all came from the employers. So the workers themselves didn't really have a piece that they had to do, which is nice from a convenience perspective, but it was also then problematic when there were errors or problems with people receiving benefits because they didn't know, was it an error from their school district? Was it an error at the employment department? What exactly, was going awry? And they weren't part of that communication chain because it was happening entirely between the employer and the employment department. So that's one of the things that we've had to navigate after the fact. And I think we can certainly say in retrospect, had we known that going in, we could have established some better standards and some better expectations with those school districts about how they were going to communicate with us, not just whether they were going to be technically compliant with what the employment department required. And this goes along with what I think is probably the strongest recommendation that I would share, that it's important to have a designated person to help troubleshoot the inevitable issues that are going to come up when you're engaging in a new program. Certainly there are challenges, individual questions from the workers themselves, but even trying to navigate those difficulties between employers and employment department is really, can be really challenging. We're fortunate that even before the pandemic, the Oregon AFL-CIO had established a sort of partnership with the employment department to have an employee of the AFL-CIO as a liaison and sort of a coordinator or essentially a problem solver working directly with employment department staff on issues like unemployment insurance. And so when WorkShare was scaling up and becoming the topic of the day, we already had someone in a position to help us navigate some of this, to help deal with some of those communications gaps, to sort of warn us about things that were starting to become problems so that we could at least try to respond to that. And I think other organizations, whatever form that person takes, having someone who can really focus their time on understanding what the challenges are or what the specific needs are to help get people through the system in your jurisdiction, whether that comes from a union, whether it comes from a legal aid center, wherever you can find someone who has that bandwidth, it really makes a huge difference. In the case of our members, I think literally hundreds of folks who got their benefits weeks sooner because we had John at the employment department working through some of these things. Another issue that I think looking ahead and trying to anticipate this rather than playing catch up on it like we had to is thinking about where changes in wages have sort of secondary effects on workers. So for example, my members participate in Oregon's public employee retirement system, and their benefits are based on the wages that are reported by their employer. Well, the wages from the employer obviously are reduced when you're participating in WorkShare, even though the employee may come out whole or come out ahead potentially. But those payments from the employment department are not counted towards their retirement benefit. So there is a certain amount of impact, fortunately fairly modest, but not zero in terms of the sort of long-term effect here. And certainly if we were looking at several months of furloughs, would have been an even more significant impact. And I would particularly, flag that benefit or flag that issue relative to folks who are close to retirement, where they're not necessarily going to have an opportunity to try to compensate or adjust for that impact. We also saw in some of the contracts that we have where benefit accruals are based on hours that are worked or are based on wages that are earned. There's, again, that potential secondary effect, and that's something that you want to make sure is in an MOU with the employer before going down the WorkShare path, rather than realizing after the fact, oh, wait, this wasn't what anyone intended, but now we have to figure out how to deal with it. And finally, I would highlight, we had certainly some employers who were very good partners in WorkShare, some who almost went out of their way to be advocates for their workers getting the WorkShare payments like they were supposed to. They were very transparent. They were very communicative. We had one school district that had a dedicated email address for their employees to send WorkShare questions, followed up on a whole series of issues that we ended up having, but those district employees were really on top of it. And I think partially that's a function of expectations that were set early on. But even in cases where you have good expectations on the front end, even things like natural attrition among the employer staff who would normally be handling these WorkShare claims, it can make follow-up and engaging with the employment department even more challenging. It becomes potentially less of a priority if that body of work is getting handed around, as I know happened in one of our school districts. By the end of the summer, we were on the third different point of contact for that district dealing with WorkShare. And needless to say, they were not very expert in it. And they were also not very excited to be taking on work that had already had, some difficulties, more work than they expected it to be. It kind of put us down an unfortunate path. And I think looking looking at these things and trying to anticipate how they're going to play out into the future will put you all in a better position to have a successful experience versus having as many of the growing pains and the challenges as we experienced. The last thing that I wanted to note in particular, as I said, a lot of my members are part-time, or a lot of them are less than 12-month employees because the school districts essentially end their position in the spring at the end of the school year. And so we saw a significant number of issues where folks were trying to transition from work share claims to regular unemployment claims over the summer. And so I would just flag for any time that you're dealing with a workforce of seasonal employees or particularly high turnover, it is one of those things that your local employment agency may not be used to thinking about how work share interfaces with their regular unemployment insurance system. And again, probably advantageous to try to have that discussion and do that research on the front end before committing, rather than having to figure out after the fact, what do you mean these people aren't getting their benefits? What do you mean they can't even file their weekly claims? Oh, it's because of a quirk in the computer system that is administering these benefits, that it doesn't know what to do when someone is trying to essentially be both a work share claimant and a regular UI claimant. So that's the very quick and short version of our experience. I think it was overall positive enough in the context of everything being terrible in 2020, but we certainly also still have a ways to go in getting all of the loose ends wrapped up for folks who should have been receiving these benefits much earlier.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you to all the panelists. And now we're moving to the Q&A section of the webinar. And if you haven't added your question already to the Q&A feature of Zoom, feel free to do so now. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to look through the Q&A section, through the chat, and then I'm going to put your question forward to each panelist. So we have a question on here from Annalena. And their question is, so does that mean that in the states without work sharing programs, we can't benefit from this program? Can we bargain for it? And I'll put that to you, George. So Adelena's question is, so does that mean in the states without work sharing programs, we can't benefit from this? Can we bargain for it?
Well, you can legislate it. You're right. There's 23 states that do not have work sharing programs. And the only way to deliver work sharing benefits in a state is to enact a work sharing law that conforms with the federal law, those 9 points that I ran through in my part of the presentation. This year, the CARES Act provided incentives for the states to enact work sharing laws. The only state that has done so far is Virginia, although there has been legislative activity in a couple of other states. Most recently, Louisiana seems to be moving toward it. Couple points on this. The CARES Act will be up for reauthorization at the end of the year. One of the things that I know NELP will be advocating for, as will others, will be an extension for at least another year of the work sharing provisions in CARES. And that would mean the federal law would still be basically telling the states, if you enact work sharing, let's say in calendar year 2021, there will be financial incentives to basically administrative grants to help you implement it and to promote it and so on. So that's kind of the hope there. It is a, it is a political battle. Sometimes you're combating misconceptions about the program from the business side. Yeah, it is a legislative action that needs to be taken if your state doesn't already have it.
Thank you, George. And I think this question would go to you as well. It's from Erica Zucker. How would work sharing work for employees whose compensation comes from tips?
Yeah, we get this question a lot. Basically, the way the program works is that an employer submits a plan to the state saying that we're going to reduce the hours of these particular workers by 20% or 40% or more. And basically you're going to get 20% of your unemployment benefit or 40% of your unemployment benefit if you have 2 hours reduced. It's not really taking that is not taking into account the tips you have on the 3 days you're working or the tips you're losing on the 2 days you're not working. So it should be fairly transparent in that way. Here's the tricky part. If you're an employer who's saying, okay, I want to spread the pain and have everybody work, lose a day. It's in, for example, the restaurant industry. That's a lot steeper climb for an employer, because if the day of week of work that you're losing is Monday, as opposed to Saturday night, and you're working in a bar or restaurant, probably the worker who has Monday off is going to be hurt a lot less than the worker who is scheduled off on Saturday. So it is trickier in industries that rely on tips for the employer to balance things out. So workers are, the impact on them is somewhat equalized. But in terms of the actual operation of the program, the tips don't disrupt the percentage of benefits that you're going to get. I hope that's clear.
Thank you, George. And this next question, because you spoke a little bit about this, Bob, and when you were talking about lessons learned and ways to make the program better, I'll put this question to Matt and JoJo to see if you have anything you want to add to that, which is from Jennifer. How can we make the process easier moving forward to address the challenges that both Matt and JoJo have discussed?
JoJo, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think so. As we shared a lot of challenges with this program, but there have been some helpful people that we've been working with on this program. As I mentioned, Margaret O'Hara, Councilmember Pinto, Councilmember Silverman have all been pushing for this program and the promotion of this program. So I don't know, Jennifer, where you're located. If it's in DC, I would encourage you to share the word about this program. If you want to host a webinar, a workshop, a training on this program, also tweeting at DOS, emailing them, and just applying a lot of pressure to them seems to get a response out of them. They have been doing a good job about, I guess, like advertising this program. So not a lot of folks know about it. So the more folks that know about it, the more pressure that's added and the more resources that can go towards this program.
If I could add on to that, I think if you built a passenger plane that crashed every time it got full, it would be a scandal. And that is essentially what has happened with these programs and unemployment insurance programs in all these states nationally, right? Like, federal government, these local governments were not prepared for a scenario in which you were going to have so many unemployed people going on the rolls at once. And that's really tragic, because there are countries like Germany that have like a very vigorous equivalent of work sharing and hours reductions that allows them to keep unemployment really, really low during crises like these. And they happen, we had the financial crisis just 10 or 12 years ago. So I think there really has to be, from my perspective, a sustained like national commitment to raise the visibility of these programs and to also design them so that they're supposed to work under high strain and not just try to like strap on more wings while the plane's, you know, in the middle of flying and suddenly turbulence hit, which is what's happening right now. So I think in a lot of respects, you know, the fact that there are a lot of states that don't have these programs is an issue. Like I represent members in Arizona as well. Well, actually Arizona has a program, but we were talking to a lot of other colleagues in the media industry whose employers are very resistant to this. Employer literacy was very low, so it was on us as a union to inform them about it. But a lot of the materials from these agencies are directed more towards employers than towards unions. They're kind of like a little bit hard to understand from the workers' perspective. So I think there could be some PR effort from these agencies to design more of these materials to be more cogent to workers and unions. And then there probably has to be some sort of incentive for employers to want to adopt these programs instead of just other types of furloughs or just plain laying people off, which is honestly the playbook in the media industry. We did encounter a lot of employers, the NewsGuild and also the Writers Guild of America East, which had the same problem. Employers who didn't really want to engage in these programs because they were unfamiliar with them, seemed weird. It sounded like a lot of paperwork, which it is. It was actually a huge burden on our HR departments. So I think any improvements to these programs have to involve streamlining the process as much as possible to minimize the paperwork strain, and give us as labor organizations a little bit better of a shot to sell these to employers at the bargaining table, because in these moments where we're really going to need it, we shouldn't have to be fighting our bosses to agree to a plan to stop layoffs. So it's just, there has to be much more sustained investment in like streamlining these programs, and also separately the fact that they're run at the state level is very difficult for us. I had to do twice the work just to figure out the program in California and DC. And that was a big impediment too. Sorry, I think there are a lot of ways these programs can be improved.
No, thank you for that, Matt and Jojo. And Bob, I know you shared during your presentation some of the things you think should be improved with the process. Did you want to add on to anything that Matt and Jojo just shared?
Well, the one thing to kind of tie it together and to George's point about states that don't already have a program, I think to the extent that you are able to lay out going forward, this is how it should be done. So for example, if you want to have a program that is very low burden on the workers in terms of submitting forms or whatever, then that's great. But understand that that is going to put a little bit more weight on the employers and potentially take employees out of the communication loop. So I think there is now enough knowledge to set these programs up more effectively, because 6 months ago, nobody knew what we were doing. It was, very much to use Matt's metaphor, we're building the plane while we're trying to fly it. And unsurprisingly, that didn't go very well.
Thank you. And before we close, I'll put one last question for it to you, George. And it's, what aspects of the work share program depend on continuation of the CARES Act benefit, which are state run? And is there a deadline for where the CARES Act benefits will stop that we know about?
Yeah.
So this is about.
Before I answer that, just want to just pick up a little bit, especially in some of the things Matt was saying, because when I've done promoted work sharing in the past, it's always what can we do to increase awareness? And the CARES Act actually did a bunch of things that should have been on their face very helpful in getting businesses and workers involved in this program as a means of ensuring greater economic security during this whole pandemic. Unfortunately, the whole world of unemployment insurance kind of melted down during this time. And as I think most of the people on this call are aware, many states faced enormous challenges with unemployment insurance volumes of 8 to 10 times more claims than they'd ever seen at any point in their history. And unfortunately, work sharing and the incentives associated with it kind of got pushed down the priority chain in many states. And it's not surprising to me even that states haven't enacted new work sharing programs, because the unemployment agencies in all these states have just been simply overwhelmed. There's still millions of people in this country who have been filing for unemployment benefits over the last 7 months and still haven't received their first dollar. So this was a good idea at the wrong time as far as the ability of the states to follow through. One practical point I want to make in terms of how states implement, one of the big barriers Matt alluded to is the how much paper there is, and specifically each week requiring the workers to submit weekly certifications. This is something that states can do better at. They can actually have the employers take greater responsibility for handling all of the weekly submissions, so that it's all in basically one transaction and easier to manage. Many states are doing that now. And the Workforce Retention Act, Senator Reed's bill that I mentioned, I hope everybody takes a look at that. And I think we'll share that in our follow-up communication, because there basically that's what that bill would do. It would one of the things it would do would just require all submissions to come from the employer, just make it all much more efficient. The original question about the CARES Act, the things that expire at the end of the year are the 100% federal reimbursement and the incentives for the states to enact work sharing laws. In my mind, the second one is very easy to extend. And I think the 100% federal reimbursement is something that should be bipartisan as well. I mean, if what you're trying to do is keep workers connected to their businesses, to their employers, and avert layoffs, most federal work sharing legislation historically has been bipartisan, at least at the federal level. So those are two things we'll be pushing to extend beyond the end of the year.
Thank you, George, and thank you to all the panelists and to all of the participants. We are at time. I'll turn over to you, Bacola, if you want to share any last details about what will be included in the email to everyone.